The day the letter arrived, it looked no different from the endless stream of envelopes the HOA sent each month. The same bland paper, the same official-looking logo in the corner, the same impersonal font that always seemed to carry bad news. Most of the time, the contents were small annoyances, warnings about trash bins left out too long, reminders about lawn height, passive-aggressive notes about community standards. But this one was different. It carried the weight of authority before it was even opened. A thicker envelope than usual, the kind that made your stomach tighten before you even knew why. Inside, I found pages of citations, references to bylaws, and a number so large I had to read it twice to believe it. $5,000. The HOA had decided my mailbox didn't meet community standards. It wasn't modern enough. They said it didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. And unless I replaced it with one of their approved designs immediately, I would face escalating fines. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. After all, my mailbox was sturdy, clean, and perfectly functional. Sure, it wasn't shiny and new, but it had character. It had been there long before the current HOA board had taken power, long before the rules about uniformity had been so aggressively enforced. But the letter left no room for interpretation. I had 30 days to comply. If I didn't, the fines would continue to grow, and eventually, the HOA would place a lien on my house. The audacity of it was staggering. $5,000 for a mailbox, not a roof repair, not a safety issue, a mailbox. I remember standing on my front lawn that afternoon, staring at it as if it had suddenly become some great enemy. The sun glinted off the faded paint, the small dent near the bottom from where a kid's bike had once clipped it. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And now, apparently, it was worth a financial war. Word spread quickly. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, whispering about how the board had gone too far this time. Some offered sympathy. Others shared their own horror stories of fines over minor landscaping violations or holiday decorations left up too long. The HOA's power loomed over everyone, but for some reason, they had chosen me as their latest target. At night, I reread the letter, the language cold and legalistic. It wasn't just a demand, it was a threat. Pay or suffer. Obey or lose. It was designed to intimidate, to make me fold without a fight. But intimidation has a funny way of backfiring. The more I thought about it, the more a different kind of resolve began to take root. If the HOA wanted to fight over a mailbox, they were going to get one, but not in the way they expected. For years, I had played by the rules, trimming my hedges to regulation height, repainting the trim when they said it was faded, keeping my trash cans tucked away like contraband. I had stayed quiet, paid my dues, and swallowed my frustration like everyone else. But this was different. This was personal. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just angry. I was ready to do something about it. The HOA had written their letter, but I was already drafting a response of my own, not with words, but with actions. Something they wouldn't see coming. Because if they wanted to treat a mailbox like it was worth $5,000, then I would make sure they got a mailbox that was worth every single penny. Not in the way they imagined, not in a way that followed their rules, but in a way that would leave the entire neighborhood talking. As the sun dipped below the horizon that night, casting long shadows across the street, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA thought they had power. They thought they could bully me into submission. But they had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. And with that thought, I began a plan. What began as fury smoldering in the chest slowly shifted into a far stranger thing, a deliberately cultivated idea that felt equal parts mischief and justice. The mailbox demand was petty, invasive, and ridiculous, but petty grievances often reveal larger truths. The HOA's letter was not just about a mailbox. It was evidence of an institution that prized uniformity over humanity, fines over fellowship, and control over common sense. The more I thought about the $5,000 demand, the more it sounded less like the board protecting a neighborhood and more like a corporation protecting its own vanity. So the plan formed like a seed in winter. Small at first, then growing roots that spread beneath the surface. It needed to be clever, theatrical, and public. It had to expose the absurdity of the HOA's priorities and force the community to look at what it had been willing to tolerate. It had to be a gift in name only, a present that would sting the board in the places that were most tender: pride, reputation, and illusion of authority. The first step was research. There were late-night hours spent hunched over a laptop, reading municipal codes, combing HOA covenants, and diving into precedent cases where associations had overreached. There were forum threads filled with outrage and solidarity, archived news articles about farcical fines, and videos of neighbors confronting boards that care more about paint shades than potholes. The internet became a map of how to push back without falling into the traps that could cost money or legal standing. I learned where the HOA's power truly ended and where individual rights began. Parallel to the legal homework was aesthetic planning. If a mailbox could be defined as a violation, then a mailbox could also be redefined as art, protest, and truth. The plan would rely on spectacle, a visual statement that was impossible to ignore and even harder penalized without exposing the board publicly. It would use humor and creativity as armor, because when people laugh, they remember, and when they remember, the narrative changes. I sketched designs on scraps of paper, wild, exaggerated, and intentionally over the top. There were half-serious designs of golden postboxes with faux pedestals, ridiculous monument-like mail towers worthy of City Square, and one that made the HOA strict color codes look like a joke, a mailbox painted in every band hue the covenants had ever mentioned. The goal was not to mock the board for the sake of cruelty, but to hold up a mirror in bright, unapologetic paint. If they wanted to treat a mailbox like a commodity, I would turn it into a symbol. There was also practical logistics. The gift needed to be impossible for the board to ignore yet defensible if they tried to force compliance. It needed to be constructed from durable materials and installed in a way that respected public right-of-way and property lines, because the last thing needed was a new legal leash for the HOA to yank. It had to be photogenic, shareable, and small enough to be assembled by a handful of neighbors one weekend night, while the HOA would least expect it. Recruitment became the next quiet campaign. The initial outrage had already moved some neighbors to the edge of resentment. The mailbox demand provided a rallying point. Conversations that had once been limited to polite nods and weather talk became furtive strategy sessions at mailbox corners and porch lights. The coalition formed naturally. An amateur woodworker who loved eccentric projects, a retired art teacher with a hoard of paints and brushes, a middle-aged couple who had lost patience with petty rules, and a teenager who understood the viral mechanics of social media better than anyone on the block. They did not all agree on aesthetics, but they agreed on purpose. I did not advertise in bold or send mass emails. Subtlety was part of the plan. An invitation slipped under a neighbor's door, a text with a single sentence sent to those who had voiced opposition in the past, a whispered ask between two parents at the elementary school pickup line. The fewer the ears, the safer the secret. Still, there were small bursts of enthusiasm. A volunteer offered a truck, another offered a stash of lights, and a retired art teacher began creating mock-ups that were both defiant and strangely beautiful. Then came the materials. The mailbox would not be a cheap stunt. If the HOA wanted $5,000 in change, then the gift would look and feel like $5,000 of intentionality. Weatherproof paint, reclaimed wood, a custom plaque, and a small brass flag. Details mattered. Every choice would be made to ensure that if the board complained publicly, their objections would sound trivial in contrast to what the neighborhood had built together. The night of the build turned into a neighborhood ritual. Instead of an act of clandestine vandalism, it became a shared creative labor. On a quiet Saturday after dark, under the yellow halo of a borrowed work light, neighbors gathered with coffee, cookies, gloves, and a toolbox. There were whispered jokes and careful work. Measuring posts, sanding edges, assembling a base that would survive storms and scoffs alike. The retired art teacher painted swirls and bands, so lively they seemed to move. The teenager crafted a QR code plaque that linked to a web page explaining the story, why the gift existed, and a photographed copy of the $5,000 letter. The QR code was the plan's final slide twist, an invitation to witness the insult and the response side by side. The finished mailbox looked ridiculous and regal at once. It stood taller than any mailbox on the block, with a pedestal built from reclaimed barnwood, a mailbox painted in a riot of coordinated colors, and a brass plaque that read, in elegantly engraved letters, a gift in response to overreach. The QR plaque was mounted beneath like a wink at modernity. Scan this to read the demand that inspired the gift. Installation was orchestrated to maximize the prize, but minimize legal exposure. It was mounted on the property line in the front yard, firmly on private property, but on the public-facing side, so that mail carriers could still deliver without obstruction. Photographs were taken at every angle to document placement and compliance with setback rules. The plan had been to simply install it overnight, wave to a few neighbors in the morning, and let the spectacle unfold. The morning after the installation, the street smelled of coffee and wet paint. The mailbox sat like a small monument to defiance, catching light and attention. Bicycles slowed, parents stopped on porches, and the teenager live-streamed a slow pan across the plaque. Phones emerged like sunflowers. The QR code was scanned. The letter was read. Screenshots filled feeds. Within hours, the story that started with a cold demand transformed into something that looked like community theater. Only the playwrights were neighbors themselves. The HOA board noticed within the day. Their reaction was not immediate thunderbolts, but a flurry of emails and texted photos asking how such a thing had been allowed. That, too, was expected. Their authority had been shaken not by legal filings, but by the court of public opinion. They could pursue fines, they could send letters, they could threaten liens, but they could not erase the images that now traveled through town. A handcrafted mailbox standing tall, a QR code that turned their demand into a public exhibit, and a neighborhood that had learned to laugh together. And beneath the laughter sat a new truth. Resistance did not have to be loud to be effective. A carefully executed, thoughtful act, in the form of a gift that was equal parts satire and artwork, could expose the board's priorities more vividly than any shouting match. The mailbox was a symbol, but it was also proof. When people come together with creativity and care, they can turn an act of intimidation into a catalyst for unity. The board's next moves would test whether they had learned anything or whether bureaucracy would double down on bureaucracy. But for that morning, with sunlight catching the painted swirls and neighbors sipping coffee as children traced hopscotch boxes around it, the gift had already done its work. It had turned a demand into an opportunity and a grievance into a statement. And the neighborhood, once sleepy and polite, had a new story to tell, one with a mailbox at heart and a growing chorus ready to defend the right to be human, to be different, and yes, to keep a mailbox that had character. The morning after the mailbox unveiling, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. Some admired the audacity, while others worried about what kind of storm it would provoke. By noon, everyone had their answer. The HOA board, embarrassed and enraged by what they called a mockery of community standards, wasted no time issuing a formal notice. The letter arrived in a crisp envelope with the association's seal, slipped neatly into the homeowner's mailbox as if daring him to laugh at it. It carried words like defacement, non-compliance, and penalty escalation. The board declared the golden mailbox not only a violation, but a public nuisance. The fines, they claimed, would continue to accrue daily until it was removed. For most residents, such a threat would have been enough. The HOA's reputation for persistence was well known, and their ability to bleed homeowners dry through fees and liens was no urban legend. But this situation was different. The homeowner wasn't just resisting for himself anymore. He was making a statement for everyone who had ever felt powerless under the board's watchful eye. Behind closed doors, the HOA scrambled. They convened emergency meetings in the clubhouse, arguing late into the night about how to reassert control. Minutes from those sessions leaked out, revealing their panic. The golden mailbox had shifted the balance of power. Instead of quiet compliance, there was now bold defiance, public, loud, and impossible to ignore. Board members fielded calls from residents who were emboldened by the stunt. Some asked why their garden decorations had been fined when other violations seemed to slide. Others questioned the board's priorities. Shouldn't they be fixing the potholes in the private streets instead of obsessing over a single mailbox? The questions were uncomfortable, and for the first time, cracks in the board's unity began to show. But the HOA wasn't ready to back down. They doubled their efforts, drafting threats of liens, and even hinting at possible legal action. They spoke of preserving the integrity of the neighborhood and preventing a breakdown in standards. In their eyes, the golden mailbox wasn't just a mailbox. It was a rebellion that could unravel everything they had worked to control. The homeowner, however, refused to cave. If anything, the HOA's bluster only hardened his resolve. Neighbors began stopping by his yard, some quietly thanking him, others boldly congratulating him for giving the board a taste of its own medicine. A few even suggested they might follow suit, replacing their own mailboxes with small acts of protest. Bright colors, odd shapes, anything to defy the monotony imposed by the HOA. What had started as a $5,000 dispute over a mailbox was snowballing into something much larger. It was no longer about aesthetics. It was about power, control, and the right to push back when rules became absurd. The HOA board sensed it too. Each day the golden mailbox stood, it eroded their grip on authority. And so, in their desperation, they plotted a bold move of their own, one that would drag the battle out of the cul-de-sac and into a much bigger arena. The fight was no longer confined to fines and letters. It was about to escalate into something neither side could have predicted. And when it did, the entire neighborhood would be forced to choose a side. The HOA's next move came swiftly, and was louder than any letter slipped into a mailbox. Within a week, notices were pinned to the community bulletin board, mailed to every resident, and even emailed with a subject line: Urgent Violation Update. The golden mailbox, they declared, was officially classified as a community-wide infraction, and the homeowner was facing escalating fines, now totaling over $7,500 with no cap in sight. But the escalation didn't stop there. The board announced their intent to pursue legal action, warning that the homeowner's refusal to comply could result in liens on his property. The language was sharp, intimidating, and deliberately crafted to instill fear, not just in him, but in anyone else who might be tempted to resist. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating the homeowner, the HOA's aggressive tactics turned the spotlight on themselves. Word of the dispute spread beyond the neighborhood. First, it appeared on local community Facebook groups, where residents posted photos of the gleaming golden mailbox with captions like, "This is what $5,000 looks like." Then, it was picked up by local reporters, hungry for a story that blended conflict, absurdity, and just the right dose of comedy. Within days, a news van parked at the entrance of the subdivision. Anchors spoke in front of the HOA clubhouse, calling it Mailbox Gate, while footage of the shining box played on screens across the county. Neighbors, once too afraid to voice dissent, found themselves laughing nervously as the story made its way to regional news outlets. Memes began circulating online, showing golden mailboxes crowned with captions like HOA royalty and $5,000 treasure chests. For the HOA board, the coverage was a nightmare. They had built their authority on the illusion of unquestioned control. Now, their rules and enforcement were being mocked in public. Their motives questioned, their power diminished. The president of the board was even ambushed by a reporter in the grocery store parking lot, forced to stammer out half-baked justifications for why a mailbox could warrant thousands in fines. The homeowner, however, remained calm. He hadn't asked for the attention, but he didn't shy away from it either. He knew that every camera pointed at his mailbox was another shield against the board's intimidation. The more public the battle became, the harder it was for the HOA to quietly strong-arm him into submission. Neighbors began to rally more openly. Families held small gatherings near the golden mailbox, turning it into a kind of neighborhood landmark. Children posed for photos beside it, laughing as if it were a tourist attraction. A few even decorated the sidewalks with chalk arrows pointing toward it, labeling it Treasure of the Cul-de-sac. The HOA was livid. They fired off yet another round of notices, threatening lawsuits, warning of irreparable damage to property values, and painting the homeowner as reckless and irresponsible. But each threat seemed to backfire. Instead of silencing the community, it fueled their resentment. What once had been a quiet grumbling about the board's overreach was turning into outright defiance. The golden mailbox was no longer just a mailbox. It was a banner of resistance. And as the story gained traction, even outsiders began weighing in, flooding HOA forums and comment sections with ridicule and criticism. The board's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. And in their desperation to reclaim control, they made a fateful choice, one that would drag the entire community into a showdown none of them would forget. By spring, the HOA had backed itself into a corner. Their letters, their fines, their threats, none of it had worked. Instead of intimidating the homeowner into compliance, they had exposed themselves as bullies. Their reputation was in tatters, mocked by neighbors and strangers alike. And so, in a last-ditch effort to reclaim authority, they filed an official lawsuit. The summons arrived on crisp, white paper stamped with the county seal. Unlike their earlier threats, this was real. The HOA was suing the homeowner for non-compliance, claiming damages to the aesthetic harmony of the community, and citing the golden mailbox as a deliberate violation that had caused irreparable harm to property values. For many, This would have been the breaking point. The prospect of standing before a judge, of facing legal fees, of risking liens on property. It was a very scenario HOAs counted on to keep residents obedient. But the homeowner was ready. Months of preparation, advice from neighbors, and even offers of pro bono legal help from outside supporters had built a foundation he could stand on. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The courthouse was crowded on the day of the hearing. Neighbors filled the benches. Reporters clustered in the back. Cameras waiting outside to capture every moment. On one side of the room sat the HOA board members, stiff and humorless, clutching binders of documents as if they held the fate of the neighborhood in their hands. On the other sat the homeowner, calm but resolute, with his attorney beside him and a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance but from truth. When the proceedings began, the HOA's case quickly faltered. They presented photos of the mailbox, blown up and displayed as though they were evidence of a crime. They quoted vague passages from outdated bylaws about uniformity and community cohesion. They insisted that the golden paint represented a slippery slope toward chaos, that if one resident was allowed to change a mailbox, soon the entire neighborhood would dissolve into disorder. But the judge was not impressed. He asked pointed questions. Where exactly did the bylaws prohibit paint colors on mailboxes? What quantifiable damage had occurred to property values? What precedent justified a $5,000 fine for a minor cosmetic difference? The HOA's answers were thin, evasive, and unconvincing. Then came the homeowner's turn. His attorney laid out the facts clearly. The mailbox was structurally identical to every other in the neighborhood. Safe, functional, and fully compliant with federal postal standards. The only difference was its color, a choice not explicitly restricted in the HOA's own documents. The fines, they argued, were not only excessive but arbitrary, wielded as a weapon rather than an enforcement tool. Neighbors were called as witnesses. One testified that the golden mailbox had become a neighborhood landmark, even boosting morale. Another pointed out that property values had risen in recent months despite the HOA's dire warnings. Even residents who had once remained neutral spoke up, describing the board behavior as bullying and overreach. Piece by piece, the HOA's case unraveled. The breaking point came when the judge leaned back, glanced at the photos of the golden mailbox, and asked dryly, "This is what all of this is about?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even the clerk struggled to hide a smile. In the end, the ruling was clear. The lawsuit was dismissed. The fines were voided. And the HOA was sternly warned about abusing its authority and misusing community funds for frivolous litigation. The courtroom erupted in relief. Neighbors hugged one another. Reporters rushed out to file their stories, and the homeowner walked away vindicated. The golden mailbox had triumphed, not just as a symbol of defiance, but as a victory for fairness and community spirit. For the HOA, it was a public humiliation. For the neighborhood, it was liberation. And for the homeowner, it was only the beginning of what he had planned. Because he wasn't finished, not yet, he still had a gift to give. The dust from the courtroom battle had barely settled when the neighborhood began to change. Freed from the grip of fear, residents walked their streets with new confidence. Decorations sprouted in gardens, porches gained color, and laughter carried a little louder on weekend evenings. The HOA's iron fist had been broken, and everyone could feel it. But for the homeowner, the story wasn't quite finished. He had promised himself that if the HOA tried to make his life miserable over a mailbox, he would give them a gift they would never forget. Now, with victory behind him and the board humiliated, the time had come. The project began quietly. Deliveries arrived at his house, boxes of wood, paint, and tools. Neighbors speculated, some guessing he was planning an addition, others wondering if it was something for the yard. Slowly, a shape began to rise near his front walk. Day by day, the structure took form until it stood taller than the golden mailbox itself, gleaming in the sun like a monument. When the reveal came, the entire neighborhood gathered. Children squealed, adults laughed, and even passers-by stopped to stare. It was not just a mailbox anymore, it was a statue, a towering replica of the original golden mailbox, sculpted larger than life, polished to a mirror finish, and set on a pedestal engraved with words that cut straight to the heart of the matter. For every neighbor who said enough, the gift wasn't spiteful, it was symbolic. It wasn't a gaudy insult to the board. It was a tribute to the people who had endured years of nitpicking, threats, and unfair fines. It was a reminder that unity and courage could stand taller than any rule book. The HOA board members, already humiliated in court, could do nothing. Their bylaws didn't forbid yard art that size, and even if they tried to fight, the community's tide had turned. Neighbors who once feared retaliation now openly mocked the board's attempts at authority. Some residents even began placing small golden ornaments in their yards, miniature mailboxes, painted stones, and shiny garden stakes, all echoing the same message: we won't be silenced. News of the statue spread beyond the neighborhood. Photos appeared online, sparking viral posts about HOA overreach and creative acts of resistance. The golden mailbox became a symbol far larger than the cul-de-sac. It became a story people across the country shared whenever they felt powerless against unfair rules. And so, the HOA that had once billed a man $5,000 for a mailbox became infamous, not for their control, but for their downfall. As for the homeowner, he didn't seek revenge for himself. His gift was to the neighborhood, for the people who deserved to reclaim their joy. Every morning when he walked outside, the golden monument caught the light, a shining reminder that sometimes the smallest battles, the ones over mailboxes, gardens, or front yard decorations, are the ones that mean the most. Because they're not really about rules. They're about freedom, dignity, and the right to stand up when enough is enough. And in this neighborhood, thanks to a golden mailbox and the courage of one man, those rights have been won back for good.